Jataka Tales, The Past Lives of Buddha Part 6. These ancient tales still explain modern life. Losaka Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a renowned teacher whose wisdom attracted students from across the land. Among those who would eventually come under his guidance was a man whose life seemed haunted by misfortune from the very beginning. The roots of that misfortune stretched back even further. Long before, there had lived a monk in a small village. He was supported by a wealthy landowner who greatly respected him and provided for all his needs. One day, an arahant arrived in the village. His calm presence and profound wisdom immediately impressed the landowner, who invited him to remain at the local monastery so they could continue their discussions. The resident monk soon grew jealous. He feared that the landowner's devotion would shift toward the newly arrived arahant, and that he himself would lose the support and respect he had long enjoyed. Driven by envy, he devised a plan. The next morning, he was supposed to accompany the arahant to the landowner's house for alms. Instead, he quietly struck the monastery gong with the back of his fingernail so softly that the arahant would not hear it. Then he went alone to the landowner and falsely claimed that the arahant had ignored the invitation because he considered the previous day's meal insufficiently luxurious. The landowner refused to believe such criticism. Assuming instead that the arahant was simply tired from his travels, he prepared an excellent meal and asked the monk to deliver it. But jealousy still controlled the monk's heart. Rather than bringing the food to the arahant, he threw it away. Almost immediately, remorse overwhelmed him. He realized the gravity of what he had done. Consumed by regret, he became ill and died not long afterward. The karmic consequences of that act followed him through countless lifetimes. He endured immense suffering in hell for an inconceivably long time. Afterward, he was reborn hundreds of times as a hungry ogre, forever searching for food and never finding satisfaction. Then he spent hundreds more lives as a starving dog, tormented by constant hunger. Eventually, he was reborn as a human child named Mittavindika, born into a family of beggars. From a moment of his conception, misfortune seemed to surround him. His parents experienced endless hardship and hunger. Convinced that the child somehow brought bad luck, they eventually drove him away. Homeless and wandering, Mittavindika eventually arrived in the city where the Bodhisattva was teaching. Out of compassion, the Bodhisattva accepted him as a charity student and offered him an education. Yet Mittavindika refused to learn. He argued with the other students, disrespected his teacher, and constantly created problems. Before long, he abandoned the school and wandered away once again. He settled in a remote village where he worked as a laborer. He married a poor woman and had 2 children. Over time, he even began teaching religious doctrine to the villagers. But wherever he went, disasters seemed to follow. The village suffered repeated punishments from the king. Fires destroyed homes again and again. Droughts ruined the water supply. Eventually, the villagers noticed that these troubles had begun shortly after Mittavindika arrived. Believing him to be the source of their bad fortune, they beat him and drove him away. His life continued to unravel. In a haunted forest, demons devoured his wife and children. Alone once more, he wandered until he found work aboard a merchant ship. 7 days into the voyage, the ship became mysteriously stranded at sea. The winds vanished, and the vessel refused to move. The sailors cast lots to determine who among them carried bad karma that might be causing their troubles. 7 times in a row, the lot fell to Mittavindika. Terrified, the crew placed him on a bamboo raft and set him adrift. The moment he left the ship, the winds returned and the vessel resumed its journey. Floating across the ocean, Mittavindika eventually reached a series of enchanted islands. On the first, he found 4 celestial spirits living in a crystal palace. They welcomed him and shared their pleasures for 7 days before departing to undergo a period of suffering as part of their karmic existence. Then he found another island with 8 such spirits living in a silver palace. Then another with 16 in a palace of jewels, and finally another inhabited by 32 spirits living within a palace of gold. Yet each time, when the spirits departed, Mitavindika left as well, never satisfied with what he already possessed and always seeking something more. Eventually, he reached a city inhabited by ogres. There he saw what appeared to be a goat wandering alone. Hungry and foolish, he seized it by the leg, intending to eat it. But the goat was actually a powerful ogress in disguise. Furious, she hurled him through the air across the ocean. Mitavindika landed in the dry moat surrounding the city where the Bodhisattva now lived. As he lay there recovering, he saw a herd of goats grazing nearby. Remembering how far the ogress had thrown him, he reasoned that perhaps another goat could send him back to one of the magical islands. So he grabbed one by the leg. The goat bleated loudly. Nearby goat herds, who had been hiding to catch thieves, rushed out and seized him. They beat him and prepared to drag him before the king. At that very moment, the Bodhisattva happened to be leaving the city to bathe. Seeing the prisoner, he recognized his former student. After hearing the story, he asked the goat herds to release Mitavindika into his care as a servant. Once they agreed, the Bodhisattva asked him to recount everything that had happened since he had left the school. When the tale was finished, the Bodhisattva gently explained that nearly all of his suffering had arisen from stubbornness, greed, and an unwillingness to accept good advice. Had he listened when wisdom was offered, many of his hardships could have been avoided. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, that same individual was reborn as Losakatissa. Even from a moment of his conception, extraordinary misfortune followed him. The village where his mother lived suffered repeated disasters, and the people eventually concluded that the family was somehow cursed. After his birth, his mother raised him only until he was old enough to survive on his own before abandoning him. As a child, Losaka survived by scavenging scraps of food from the streets. One day, Sariputta, one of the Buddha's greatest disciples, saw him gathering discarded grains of rice and took pity on him. Hearing the boy's story, Sariputta invited him to become a novice monk. Losaka gladly accepted and eventually became a fully ordained monk. Through great effort and dedication, he ultimately attained arahantship. Yet despite his spiritual attainment, the effects of his past karma continued to manifest. Food always seemed to elude him. Whenever people offered alms, his bowl appeared miraculously full after receiving only a small portion, causing others to believe he needed nothing more. On the final day of Losaka's life, Sariputta sensed that his death was approaching. Wanting his friend to enjoy one truly satisfying meal before passing into nirvana, he accompanied him on alms round. Yet because of Losaka's karma, they received nothing. Sariputta then personally sought food for him. Several attempts failed due to strange mishaps, but eventually he obtained honey, butter, ghee, and sugar from the king's palace. Returning to the monastery, he stood beside Losaka and held the bowl himself, ensuring that no accident could prevent him from eating. For the first time in his life, Losaka ate until he was completely satisfied. Not long afterward, he peacefully entered nirvana. When the monks later wondered how someone who had experienced such extraordinary misfortune could nevertheless attain enlightenment, the Buddha revealed this story. He explained that Losaka's suffering had been the result of karma created long ago by jealousy and selfishness. Yet through perseverance, virtue, and dedication to the path, he had ultimately overcome even those powerful consequences and achieved complete liberation. Kapota Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a pigeon. During that era, it was common for people to hang baskets around their homes so birds could nest safely, and the Bodhisattva lived comfortably in the kitchen of the king's treasurer. The cooks and servants were accustomed to his presence, and he spent his days peacefully searching for seeds and grains before returning each evening to his basket. One day, a crow flying overhead caught the scent of fish and meat being prepared in the kitchen. The aroma was irresistible. Curious, he followed it to its source and soon noticed the Bodhisattva entering the building freely. Realizing that the pigeon had access to a place full of delicious food, The crow immediately began devising a way to gain access for himself. The next morning, the crow followed the bodhisattva wherever he went. He accompanied him from field to field and tree to tree, never leaving his side. The bodhisattva eventually became curious and asked why he was behaving this way. After all, pigeons and crows had very different diets and habits. The crow replied with flattering words. He claimed that he deeply admired the bodhisattva's calm and noble character and wished to remain in his company. He said he wanted to learn from him and spend his days by his side. The bodhisattva sensed that the crow's motives were not entirely pure, but he chose not to argue. That evening, when the kitchen cook noticed the crow accompanying the pigeon, he kindly hung up a second basket so the newcomer would have a place to sleep. For several days, the two birds lived together in the kitchen without incident. The crow patiently waited for an opportunity. Then one day, the cook hung several fresh fish inside the kitchen to dry. The moment the crow saw them, his greed overwhelmed him. He decided that the time had finally come to claim the reward he had been waiting for. That night, he could barely sleep. He spent the hours groaning and shifting restlessly in his basket. The next morning, when the bodhisattva prepared to leave in search of food, the crow claimed he was ill and unable to travel. He insisted that he needed to stay behind and rest. The bodhisattva immediately understood what was happening. Crows, he knew, did not suddenly develop mysterious stomach ailments. He realized that the crow intended to steal the fish as soon as the kitchen was empty. Patiently, the bodhisattva warned him. He explained that greed often blinds people to danger and that dishonest gains rarely end well. He urged the crow to abandon the idea and leave with him, but the crow refused to listen. As soon as the bodhisattva departed, the crow waited for the cook to leave the room. Then he flew toward the hanging fish. Unfortunately for him, he was careless. As he landed, he crashed noisily into a metal colander, creating a loud clatter that echoed throughout the kitchen. The cook rushed back inside and immediately understood what had happened. Furious, he seized the crow. As punishment, he plucked out all of his feathers, covered his body with spices and sauce, and tossed him back into his basket. The crow was left humiliated, injured, and suffering greatly. Later that day, the bodhisattva returned and found his companion in miserable condition. He felt pity for the crow, but he also knew that the suffering had been self-inflicted. The bodhisattva reminded him that greed had brought him to this fate. He had been offered good advice, warned of the consequences, and given every opportunity to avoid disaster. Yet he had ignored wisdom in pursuit of a momentary pleasure. Realizing that the kitchen was no longer a suitable place to live, the bodhisattva left and found another dwelling elsewhere. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, there was a monk known for his greed and attachment to material comforts. Despite receiving repeated guidance, he often struggled to restrain his desires. When the Buddha learned of his behavior, he told this story to show that the same tendency had existed in previous lives as well. Just as greed had once led him into suffering as a crow, it continued to create difficulties whenever he allowed it to control his actions. The Buddha used the story to remind his disciples that wisdom is not merely hearing good advice, but having the discipline to follow it before consequences arrive. Valuka Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a wise ascetic living in the Himalayas. He led a community of disciples who had gathered around him to study, meditate, and cultivate spiritual understanding. The ascetics lived simply, depending on the forest for their needs, and dedicating themselves to a life of discipline and contemplation. Among the disciples was one man who had developed an unusual attachment. He had found a snake and kept it as a pet inside a hollow bamboo tube. Over time, he became deeply fond of the creature and cared for it as though it were a beloved child. When the Bodhisattva learned about this, he warned the disciple that it was unwise. A snake, he explained, follows its own nature. No matter how much affection someone may feel toward it, a dangerous creature remains dangerous. He advised the disciple to release the snake before harm came from keeping it confined, but the disciple refused to listen. He insisted that the snake loved him and would never hurt him. His attachment had become so strong that he ignored the Bodhisattva's repeated warnings. To him, the snake was not a threat but a companion, and he could not imagine letting it go. Sometime later, the community of ascetics traveled into the forest to gather fruits and other necessities. They remained away from their dwellings for several days. Throughout that time, the snake remained trapped inside its bamboo container. When the ascetics finally returned, the disciple hurried to his pet, eager to feed it as he had done countless times before. Confident that nothing had changed, he opened the bamboo tube and reached inside. But the snake had spent days confined and agitated. Angry and distressed from its captivity, it reacted according to its nature. In an instant, it struck. Its fangs pierced the disciple's hand, delivering a deadly bite. The poison spread rapidly through his body, and he died almost immediately. The tragedy unfolded exactly as the Bodhisattva had predicted. The disciple had mistaken attachment for understanding and affection for safety. By refusing to accept wise advice, he had brought suffering upon himself. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, there was a monk known for being stubborn and resistant to guidance. Even when experienced teachers offered sound advice, he often insisted on following his own views. When the Buddha learned of this tendency, he told the story of the ascetic and the snake. Through it, he reminded the monk that stubbornness can blind a person to danger and prevent them from recognizing wisdom when it is offered. Just as the disciple in the past had ignored repeated warnings and suffered the consequences, anyone who refuses good counsel risks creating unnecessary suffering for themselves. True wisdom begins with the willingness to listen, reflect, and let go of attachments that cloud judgment. Jataka, in a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a merchant who traveled widely from town to town conducting business. During one of his journeys, he arrived at a remote village near the frontier and stayed for a time in the home of a carpenter. One day, while the Bodhisattva was there, the carpenter was hard at work shaping a piece of wood. As he concentrated on his task, a mosquito landed on his head and began biting him. Annoyed but unwilling to stop working, he called to his son for help. "There's a mosquito on my head," he said. "Get rid of it for me." The son eagerly rushed to assist his father. Unfortunately, although he meant well, he possessed very little wisdom or common sense. Spotting the mosquito, he looked around for something to strike it with. Instead of choosing a harmless tool, he grabbed a sharp axe. Without pausing to think, he swung the axe down with all his strength. The mosquito escaped unharmed. The carpenter did not. The blow split open his father's skull and killed him instantly. The villagers were horrified. What had begun as a simple attempt to help had ended in a far greater disaster than the mosquito could ever have caused. Having witnessed the entire event, the Bodhisattva reflected on what had happened and shared a lesson with those gathered around him. He explained that a foolish friend can be far more dangerous than an intelligent enemy. A wise enemy at least understands consequences and often restrains himself out of caution, fear, or self-interest. But a fool, even when acting with good intentions, can cause tremendous harm because he lacks judgment. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, he arrived at a village while traveling on an alms round and noticed that many of the villagers were injured. Some had cuts, others bruises, and several were seriously wounded. Curious about what had happened, the Buddha asked them. The villagers explained that mosquitoes from a nearby forest had become a constant nuisance. Frustrated by the insects, they had decided to organize an attack against them. Armed with bows and arrows, they marched into the forest intending to wage war on the mosquitoes. But in their confusion and lack of coordination, the mosquitoes proved impossible targets. Instead, the villagers ended up shooting arrows at one another. By the end of their campaign, they had inflicted more injuries on themselves than the mosquitoes ever had. When the Buddha heard this story, he smiled and told them about a previous life in which the same lack of wisdom had produced a similar result. He explained that two of the villagers involved had once been the carpenter and his son. Just as before, they had attempted to solve a small problem and instead created a far greater one through foolish action. The Buddha used the story to remind his disciples that good intentions alone are not enough. Wisdom must guide action, because without understanding, even attempts to help can lead to suffering. A small problem approached foolishly often becomes a much larger one. Rohini Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a royal treasurer, a wise and respected advisor known throughout the kingdom for his sound judgment and practical wisdom. One day, an unfortunate incident occurred in the household of one of his servants. A young woman was busy pounding rice with a heavy pestle while her elderly mother sat nearby. As they worked, a swarm of flies began buzzing around the old woman, landing on her face and constantly irritating her. Growing increasingly annoyed, the mother called out to her daughter and asked her to drive the flies away. The daughter immediately tried to help, but instead of stopping to think, she acted impulsively. Seeing several flies resting on her mother's head, she lifted the heavy pestle she had been using to pound rice and brought it down with all her strength, hoping to kill the insects in a single blow. The flies escaped. Her mother did not. The pestle struck the old woman directly, killing her instantly. What had begun as an attempt to help ended in a terrible tragedy. When news of the incident spread, people gathered in shock and disbelief. The daughter had not acted out of anger or malice. She genuinely wanted to help her mother, yet her lack of wisdom had caused far more harm than the flies ever could have. When the Bodhisattva heard what had happened, he reflected on the event and shared a lesson with those around him. He explained that a foolish friend can be more dangerous than a wise enemy. An intelligent enemy often understands consequences and may restrain his actions. A fool, however, can cause enormous harm even when his intentions are good, simply because he acts without understanding. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, a royal treasurer visited him and recounted a remarkably similar accident. One of his servants had attempted to kill flies bothering her mother and had accidentally struck and killed her with a pestle. After listening to the story, the Buddha revealed that this was not the first time such an event had occurred. He explained that the servant and her mother had lived before and had experienced the very same tragedy in a previous life. Then he recounted this story to illustrate an important truth. Good intentions alone do not guarantee good outcomes. Without wisdom, patience, and careful thought, even acts meant to help can lead to suffering. Through the story, the Buddha reminded his listeners that wisdom is what transforms kindness into something truly beneficial. Without it, even affection and concern can become causes of harm. Aramadusika Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a wise and respected man, known for his good judgment and understanding of human nature. One year, a great festival was being celebrated throughout the city. Music filled the streets, crowds gathered for performances, and people came from all around to join the festivities. The king's gardener, eager to participate, faced a dilemma. He was responsible for maintaining the royal park, especially the young trees that required daily watering. Looking for a temporary solution, he turned to a troop of monkeys that lived in the park. The monkeys benefited greatly from the garden, enjoying its fruits, shoots, and shelter throughout the year. The gardener thought they might be willing to help in return. Before leaving, he entrusted them with his watering cans and water skins and asked them to care for the young trees until he returned. The Monkey King agreed. At first, he was determined to perform the task well. He gathered the other monkeys and explained that they needed to be careful with the water. If they used too much on the first trees, they might not have enough left for the rest. Wanting to be efficient, the Monkey King devised what he believed was a clever plan. Before watering a tree, he told his followers, "Pull out of the ground and examine its roots. Trees with large roots should receive plenty of water. Trees with small roots should receive only a little." The monkeys thought this sounded reasonable and immediately got to work. All across the royal garden, they began yanking young trees from the soil, inspecting their roots, and then replanting them before deciding how much water to give them. As luck would have it, the Bodhisattva happened to pass by the park while this was taking place. He stopped in disbelief as he watched the monkeys pulling up tree after tree. Curious, he asked them what they were doing. The monkeys proudly explained that they were caring for the garden according to the instructions of their king. They described the system they had created to conserve water and ensure that each tree received exactly the amount it needed. The Bodhisattva immediately understood the problem. The monkeys genuinely wanted to help. They were not acting out of laziness or malice. Yet in their ignorance, they were causing far more damage than neglect ever would have. He shook his head and rebuked the Monkey King for his foolishness. Then he remarked to those nearby that this is often the way of ignorant people. They may sincerely wish to do good, but without wisdom and understanding, their efforts end up causing harm instead. Good intentions alone, he explained, are not enough. When action is not guided by knowledge, even helpful plans can become destructive. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, he and several disciples were invited to take a meal in the beautiful garden of a wealthy supporter. After eating, the monks walked through the grounds and noticed a large barren area where no trees grew. Curious, they asked the gardener what had happened. The gardener explained that he had once hired a village boy to water the young trees while he was away. The boy had decided that the best way to determine how much water each tree required was to pull them out of the ground and inspect their roots. Unsurprisingly, most of the trees withered and died shortly afterward, leaving behind the empty patch the monks now saw. Later, when the disciples told the Buddha about the incident, he smiled and revealed that the boy had behaved this way before. He explained that the village boy had once been the Monkey King in a previous life. Just as he had destroyed a garden through ignorance then, he had repeated the same mistake again in the present. The Buddha used the story to teach that wisdom is just as important as good intentions. A person may sincerely wish to help, but without understanding, patience, and proper knowledge, their actions can easily create the very harm they hope to prevent. Jataka, in a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a royal treasurer, a man respected throughout the kingdom for his wisdom, sound judgment, and ability to understand the true causes behind people's successes and failures. One day, a tavern keeper who lived under the Bodhisattva's protection came to him with an amusing but frustrating story. The tavern owner had needed to leave his business for a short time to go bathe, so he entrusted the establishment to his young apprentice. The apprentice was eager to do a good job and wanted to impress both the customers and his master. As he watched the patrons, he noticed that many of them liked to eat salty snacks before drinking. Seeing this, he came to what seemed, in his mind, a brilliant conclusion. If customers enjoy salt before they drink, he reasoned, they must enjoy it even more if the salt is already mixed into the liquor. Convinced he had discovered a way to improve the tavern's offerings, he began adding salt directly into the barrels of alcohol. The result was disastrous. The liquor was completely ruined. When customers took their first sip, they immediately spat it out in disgust. Complaints spread throughout the tavern, and before long people were leaving in frustration. By the time the tavern keeper returned, his business was nearly empty and an entire batch of liquor had been wasted. The apprentice, meanwhile, stood there confused. He had genuinely believed he was helping. After hearing the story, the Bodhisattva smiled and explained the lesson hidden within it. A person may have good intentions, he said, but good intentions alone are not enough. Without wisdom, understanding, and proper judgment, even an attempt to improve something can make matters worse. Often, those who know the least are the quickest to interfere, believing they're helping while unknowingly causing damage. The apprentice had not acted out of malice. His mistake came from ignorance. Yet the outcome was harmful all the same. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, Anathapindika, the great benefactor known for his extraordinary generosity, visited the Buddha and shared a humorous story about a friend who owned a tavern. The tavern keeper had briefly left his apprentice in charge, only to return and discover that the young man had mixed salt into the liquor because he believed customers would enjoy it more that way. Instead, he had driven away nearly everyone who entered the tavern. After listening, the Buddha revealed that this was not the first time such a thing had happened. He explained that the apprentice had behaved in exactly the same way in a previous life. Then he told this story to illustrate how people often repeat the same mistakes when they fail to develop wisdom. The Buddha used the tale to teach that enthusiasm without understanding can be dangerous. A good heart is valuable, but it must be guided by knowledge and careful reflection. Otherwise, a person may sincerely wish to help while accidentally destroying the very thing they hope to improve. Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a devoted student studying under a renowned Brahmin teacher. His master possessed a rare and powerful secret known as the Vidabha spell, a magical incantation capable of making treasures fall from the sky. When recited under a specific alignment of the stars and planets, it could summon a rain of gold, silver, pearls, coral, rubies, diamonds, and other precious jewels. One day, while traveling together through a remote forest, the teacher and the Bodhisattva were captured by a band of thieves. The robbers intended to hold the Brahmin hostage while sending the student away to collect a ransom. Before leaving, the Bodhisattva privately warned his teacher. He knew that the celestial alignment required for the spell would occur that very night. He also understood his master's weakness, impatience. The Bodhisattva urged him not to use the spell under any circumstances. He explained that if he attempted to gain freedom through greed and convenience rather than patience, disaster would follow. The teacher promised nothing. After sunset, as the stars moved into position, the Brahmin's desire for immediate freedom overcame his better judgment. He revealed his secret to the bandits and offered to make them rich if they released him. The thieves were astonished. They immediately untied him, bathed him, dressed him in fresh garments, covered him with perfumes and flower garlands, and waited eagerly for the miracle. The Brahmin recited the spell. Moments later, treasures began pouring from the sky. Gold, silver, pearls, rubies, coral, cat's-eye gems, and diamonds rained down upon the forest floor. The thieves gathered the riches in delight and set off through the woods with the Brahmin accompanying them. But greed rarely ends where it begins. Before they could leave the forest, a second band of robbers ambushed them. The first group was quickly overwhelmed and captured. When the second gang learned about the Brahmin's extraordinary power, they demanded that he produce another shower of treasure. The teacher explained that the spell could only be performed during a specific celestial alignment, and that they would have to wait an entire year before the conditions returned. The thieves did not want to hear this, believing he was withholding wealth from them. One of the robbers drew his sword and cut the Brahmin down on the spot. The second gang then hunted down the first group of thieves and slaughtered them all to seize the treasure for themselves. Yet their victory was short-lived. Once the wealth was in their possession, greed began consuming them from within. Arguments broke out over how the treasure should be divided. Suspicion replaced loyalty. Violence replaced cooperation. One by one, the thieves turned on each other until only two remained alive. The surviving pair carried the treasure off the road and hid it in a secluded place. One stayed behind to guard it, while the other went to a nearby village to buy food. But neither man was satisfied with owning half. The guard decided he would kill his companion when he returned and claim everything for himself. Meanwhile, the thief who went for food secretly poisoned part of the rice, planning to murder his partner and keep the entire fortune. When he returned, the waiting thief attacked immediately and killed him. Victorious, he sat down beside the treasure and began eating the rice his companion had brought. Before long, the poison took effect. The final thief collapsed and died. The treasure remained untouched, surrounded by corpses. Not long afterward, the Bodhisattva returned carrying the ransom money. When he failed to find either the thieves or his teacher, he knew at once that his warning had been ignored. Following the trail through the forest, he eventually discovered the bodies, the abandoned treasure, and the remains of the terrible chain of events. Seeing what greed had created, he understood exactly what had happened. Standing there among the dead, the Bodhisattva reflected that selfish desire inevitably leads to suffering. Those who pursue wealth without wisdom often destroy not only themselves, but everyone around them. The treasure they seek becomes the very cause of their downfall. The forest spirits who heard his words applauded his insight. The Bodhisattva gathered the abandoned wealth and brought it home. Rather than using it for personal luxury, he devoted it to generosity, charitable works, and helping others for the rest of his life. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, there was a monk known for being stubborn and unwilling to accept advice. Even when wise counsel was offered, he often insisted on following his own opinions. Seeing this tendency, the Buddha told him the story of the Brahmin and the treasure rain. He explained that the Brahmin teacher had been that very monk in a previous life. Just as he had ignored wise advice then and brought ruin upon himself and many others, he continued to risk suffering whenever pride prevented him from listening. The Buddha used the story to teach that wisdom often lies not in what we know, but in our willingness to listen. A single moment of impatience or greed can undo years of good fortune, while humility and restraint can prevent countless tragedies before they begin. Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a wise and respected man whose judgment was trusted by many. During that time, a family from a prosperous town arranged a marriage with a young woman from the countryside. After lengthy discussions, both families agreed on a date for the wedding and preparations began immediately. Everything seemed settled. However, after choosing the day, the townspeople decided to consult a wandering ascetic who claimed to possess knowledge of the stars and their influence over human affairs. They wanted reassurance that the date they had selected would bring good fortune. The ascetic was irritated. No one had asked for his opinion before making the arrangements, and he felt slighted by being consulted only after the decision had already been made. Rather than speaking honestly, he allowed his pride to guide him. Although there was nothing wrong with the chosen date, he falsely declared that the alignment of the stars was unfavorable. He warned that if the marriage took place on that day, misfortune and suffering would surely follow. The townspeople believed him. Frightened by his prediction, they decided not to attend the wedding on the agreed date. Meanwhile, the bride's family in the countryside waited patiently for their guests to arrive. They prepared food, gathered relatives, and organized the celebration. But the day passed and nobody came. At first they were confused, then they became offended. The townspeople themselves had chosen the date, yet they had failed to honor their commitment without offering any explanation. Feeling insulted and unwilling to leave their daughter waiting indefinitely, the family accepted another marriage proposal. Before long, the young woman was married to someone else. The following day, the townspeople finally arrived. Expecting the wedding to proceed, they were stunned to discover that the bride had already married another man. An argument immediately broke out. Both sides blamed the other. Voices were raised, accusations were exchanged, and tempers flared. The Bodhisattva happened to be in the village at that time on business. Hearing the commotion, he approached and learned what had occurred. After listening to both sides, he shook his head and addressed the townspeople. He told them that they had brought this disappointment upon themselves. Instead of honoring their agreement, they had allowed fear and superstition to govern their actions. A marriage had been lost not because of fate, destiny, or the stars, but because they chose to trust a resentful man over their own judgment and their own word. The Bodhisattva explained that good fortune does not come from lucky constellations, nor does misfortune come from unlucky ones. What shapes people's lives are their decisions, actions, and character. Having missed their opportunity, the townspeople returned home without a bride. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, a remarkably similar event took place. Once again, two families arranged a marriage. Once again, a wandering ascetic was consulted after the plans had already been made. And once again, offended that nobody had sought his advice earlier, he falsely claimed that the chosen day was unlucky. The result was almost identical to the previous life. The marriage collapsed, both families suffered disappointment, and everyone involved blamed fate instead of recognizing the real cause. When the Buddha later heard people discussing the failed wedding, he told this story. He explained that the same families and the same ascetic had been involved in a similar incident long ago. Just as before, pride, superstition, and poor judgment had created unnecessary suffering. The Buddha used the story to teach that wisdom comes from understanding causes and consequences rather than blindly trusting predictions. A person's future is shaped far more by their actions than by the position of the stars, and opportunities are often lost when fear is allowed to override common sense. Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a king who ruled with wisdom, compassion, and justice. He governed according to the 10 royal virtues, always seeking the welfare of his people rather than his own comfort or glory. At that time, animal sacrifice was a common practice throughout the kingdom. Whenever people sought blessings, prosperity, protection, or success, they often offered the lives of animals to various deities, believing such acts would earn divine favor. Even while he was still a crown prince, the Bodhisattva was troubled by this custom. He saw the suffering it caused and wished to end it, but he understood that simply forbidding the practice would likely provoke resistance. Instead, he devised a more subtle plan. Outside the city stood a great banyan tree that was believed to be inhabited by a powerful tree spirit. The site was revered by the local population, and many people came there to pray and make offerings. The Bodhisattva began regularly visiting the tree himself. He joined the worshippers, offering flowers and perfumes, pouring water around the roots, and respectfully circling the trunk. Over time, people came to believe that he was especially devoted to the sacred tree and its guardian spirit. Years later, after the Bodhisattva inherited the throne, he summoned his ministers and advisors. He informed them that while he had still been a prince, he had made a solemn vow to the tree spirit. If he ever became king, he had promised to offer a great sacrifice in gratitude. The advisors eagerly asked what offering the king intended to make. The Bodhisattva replied that he would fulfill his promise by offering the flesh and blood of 1,000 people who violated the precepts, committed evil deeds, and lived immoral lives. He then ordered his officials to spread the proclamation throughout the kingdom. Drums were beaten in every town and village as heralds announced the royal decree. From that day forward, anyone who engaged in wrongdoing, cruelty, theft, violence, dishonesty, or harmful conduct risked becoming part of the king's promised sacrifice. The effect was immediate. Fear spread across the kingdom. People who had once behaved carelessly became cautious. Those who had harmed others abandoned their misconduct. Criminals became law-abiding citizens. Even the practice of animal sacrifice disappeared, since nobody wanted to risk being classified among those living unwholesome lives. The Bodhisattva never had to carry out his threat, not because he changed his mind, but because no one gave him a reason to. Through wisdom rather than force, he transformed the behavior of an entire kingdom. The animals were spared, violence diminished, and virtue flourished throughout the land. The years he passed peacefully, and the kingdom prospered under his rule. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, some monks were discussing the extraordinary qualities of the Buddha. They spoke of his compassion toward all living beings, his ability to guide people away from harmful actions, his dedication to helping others, and the countless ways he worked for the welfare of the world. When the Buddha heard their conversation, he explained that this concern for the well-being of others was not something new. Throughout many previous lives, he had repeatedly acted for the benefit of both humans and animals, often finding skillful ways to reduce suffering and encourage virtue. To illustrate this, he told the story of his life as the righteous king who ended animal sacrifice without violence or coercion. The Buddha explained that the king's advisors in the story had been earlier births of the monks listening to him now. Just as they had assisted him in promoting virtue in that distant age, they continued to walk beside him on the path of wisdom in the present. Through this story, the Buddha taught that true leadership does not rely on punishment alone. The wisest leaders understand human nature and find skillful ways to guide others toward goodness. By transforming hearts rather than merely controlling actions, they create lasting change that benefits everyone.